A mobster disguised himself as a priest and entered the confessional to test his fiancée. What she confessed. Each like and comment helps heart pulses touch even more hearts. Join us for the next story. Daniel Colombo watched Vittoria through his mansion's security cameras, his impassive face revealing nothing of the storm brewing inside him as he saw her grab her coat and the small black purse she always carried. 3 months had passed since she had arrived at his house as payment for her father's astronomical debt, and during all this time, she had remained like an ice statue, polite but distant, obedient but never submissive. Tomorrow they would marry, a contract that would definitively seal the agreement, and he still didn't know if behind that courteous silence there was hatred, resignation, or complete indifference. When he saw her place a black veil over her brown hair, Daniel immediately understood her destination, and a decision formed in his calculating mind. "The church," he murmured to the empty office, drumming his fingers on the mahogany desk. "She's going to confess before tying herself to a man like me." The plan formed quickly in his methodical mind, the same one that commanded a crime empire without ever showing weakness or hesitation. Daniel picked up the phone and dialed Father Antonio's number, the old priest who owed too many favors to the Colombo family to refuse any request, no matter how absurd. The conversation was brief and direct, like all of Daniel's negotiations, and in 15 minutes everything was arranged. The priest would disappear for a few hours and leave the sacristy key in the agreed place. While driving through the narrow streets toward the church, Daniel maintained his impassive face, refusing to examine too deeply the reasons that led him to such subterfuge. "It's just curiosity," he told himself, ignoring the tightness in his chest. "I need to know if she plans to escape or if she has accepted her fate. Nothing more than that." The sacristy was empty and silent when Daniel entered, the smell of incense and wax permeating the air, like memories of a life he had abandoned decades ago. Father Antonio's cassock hung in the wardrobe like a shroud, and he put it on with efficient movements, physically transforming into something his soul had long ceased to be. The rough fabric irritated his skin, accustomed to the finest fabrics money could buy. But Daniel ignored the discomfort with the same coldness with which he ignored any inconvenience in his life. Men like him didn't allow themselves emotional luxuries, not after years of building walls around a heart that had learned too early that feelings were vulnerabilities that enemies exploited without mercy. "I'll listen to her and then proceed with the wedding as planned," he rationalized as he headed to the confessional. "Nothing she says will change the fact that tomorrow she will be my wife." The confessional was a relic from more devout times. Dark wood carved with scenes of penance and redemption that Daniel found ironically appropriate for the theater he was about to perform. He settled into the tight space intended for the priest, his body too large for the narrow cubicle, and waited in the dimness with the predatory patience that characterized him in important negotiations. Through the ornate grate, he could see the empty nave of the church, the flickering candles creating dancing shadows on the ancient stone walls. The sound of feminine heels echoing on the marble floor announced Vittoria's arrival, and Daniel straightened his posture, mentally preparing himself to maintain the disguise regardless of what he was about to hear. "Be strong," he ordered himself. "Show the same coldness you show when ordering the elimination of an enemy." Vittoria stopped before the confessional, and Daniel could see her silhouette through the red velvet curtains, the delicate form of her body that he had memorized from afar, but never allowed himself to touch beyond what was necessary. For 3 months he had maintained a calculated distance, treating her with cold courtesy, providing everything she needed materially but never offering any human warmth. It was safer this way, was what he repeated to himself on the nights he stood at her bedroom door, watching her sleep and fighting against impulses he didn't understand. Men like Daniel Colombo didn't love. They possessed, controlled, dominated, but never loved, because love was a weakness he couldn't allow himself. "Come in already," he thought impatiently. "Say what you have to say so I can finally bury this inappropriate curiosity." The creak of ancient wood signaled when Vittoria finally entered, kneeling with a heavy sigh that Daniel felt echo somewhere deep that he preferred to ignore. Through the grate, he could see only her profile partially obscured, but the tension in her delicate shoulders was evident, as was the trembling in her interlaced hands. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of their breathing, until finally she began to speak in a voice so low and broken that Daniel had to lean forward to hear, momentarily forgetting the need to maintain distance. The ritual words of confession came trembling from her lips, and then she took a deep breath before continuing. "Father, tomorrow I marry a man I did not choose," she said, and Daniel felt her words like ice in his veins, confirming what he had always known but never wanted to admit. Daniel forced his voice to sound different, deeper and rougher, disguising the timbre that Vittoria knew from the rare conversations they shared. His hands gripped his knees tightly as he responded with the traditional words, the hypocrisy of his situation not lost on him, but promptly ignored. Men like him were masters at compartmentalizing, at separating actions from consequences, at doing what was necessary without letting conscience interfere. When he encouraged Vittoria to continue, his voice came out more controlled, more distant, exactly how he conducted all aspects of his life. "Speak, my child," he said, maintaining a neutral tone despite the storm beginning to form within him. "Confess what weighs on your heart." Vittoria took several deep breaths before continuing, and when the words came, they flowed like a broken dam, each revelation more devastating than the last. She spoke about how her father had sold her to pay gambling debts, how she had been taken to the Colombo mansion as if she were an object acquired at auction. Daniel listened impassively, or at least tried to remain so, as she described the life she led in his home, always watched, always controlled, never free. Each word confirmed what he already knew, that she saw him as her jailer, her owner, never as a man and certainly never as someone worthy of any feeling beyond resignation. "It's better this way," he told himself, ignoring the strange tightness in his chest. "It's easier when there are no illusions, when expectations are clear." But then Vittoria continued, and her next words made Daniel freeze completely, his body tense like that of a predator, noticing an unexpected change in its prey. She began to describe small details she had noticed about him, things that Daniel was certain went unnoticed in his carefully controlled routine. Vittoria confessed that she pretended to sleep when he entered her room late at night, that she felt when he adjusted her blanket with unexpected care, that she memorized the particular sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Each revelation was like a crack in the walls Daniel had built around himself, small but dangerous, threatening the entire structure of his emotionally sterile existence. She notices these things, he thought, struggling to maintain composure. But that means nothing, it's just observation, survival, nothing more. Vittoria's confession became more intense, more personal, and Daniel felt each word as a blow to his carefully maintained defenses. She described how she memorized the clothes he wore, how she knew his different perfumes, how her heart raced when she heard his voice giving orders downstairs. She admitted that sometimes she went downstairs just to see him in his office, always working, always with that serious expression that she described with details Daniel didn't know anyone noticed. Each word was a disturbing revelation, showing that Vittoria observed him with the same intensity with which he observed her, but certainly for different reasons. "She's studying the enemy," Daniel rationalized coldly, "looking for weaknesses, opportunities for escape. It's what any intelligent person would do." Then came the part of the confession that changed everything, the words that Vittoria pronounced with such suffering that even Daniel's armored heart felt the impact. She told about the man who had disrespected her with inappropriate comments, and how Daniel had reacted with cold, controlled fury, making the man cower in fear. Vittoria described the moment when their gazes met afterward, and how she had seen something in his eyes that confused her, something that seemed like genuine protection instead of a simple demonstration of possession. Daniel remembered that moment perfectly, remembered the primitive anger he had felt seeing another man looking at Vittoria with desire, but had always attributed it to his sense of ownership, nothing more. "She's reading too much into the situation," he thought rigidly. "I protect what's mine, it's as simple as that, there's no feeling involved." The silence that followed was heavy, and Daniel observed through the grate as Vittoria brought her hands to her face, her shoulders trembling with the effort of containing her emotions. When she spoke again, her voice was broken, the words coming out between stifled sobs that Daniel pretended not to notice, remaining rigidly still on his side of the confessional. What she said next should have been predictable, but it still hit him with the force of a punch to the stomach, leaving him momentarily breathless. "I fell in love with him, Father," Vittoria confessed, the words torn from her soul like a confession of an unforgivable crime. "I fell in love with the man who bought me, with the mafioso who imprisoned me." Daniel was completely paralyzed, his rational mind trying to process this impossible information while something deep and long buried within him tried to awaken. Vittoria continued her confession, describing dreams that tormented her, where Daniel touched her with tenderness, where he pronounced words of love he would never say in reality. She confessed to waking from these dreams with shame and desire, hating herself for loving someone who saw her only as property. Each word was an exquisite torture, showing Daniel a distorted reflection of his own sleepless nights, his own forbidden dreams that he always attributed to simple physical desire. "No," he thought fiercely, fighting against the truth that threatened to emerge. "I am not capable of love, never have been, never will be." Vittoria's tears were audible now, her sobs echoing in the sacred space as she poured out her heart to a man she thought was a priest. She spoke about the torture of loving someone who would never love her back, about the cruel punishment of marrying a man she desired with every fiber of her being, but who saw her only as an object acquired to settle a debt. Daniel clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, fighting against every instinct that screamed for him to tear down that screen between them and take her in his arms. But men like him didn't console, didn't comfort, didn't love. They conquered, dominated, possessed, but never loved. "She's confused," he told himself rigidly. "She's mistaking protection for love. She'll get over it with time." When Daniel finally spoke, offering the ritual words of absolution, his voice came out hoarse and strange even to his own ears. He struggled to maintain the disguise as he pronounced words he had no right to say, absolving sins when he himself was the greatest sinner in that equation. Vittoria stood up abruptly as soon as he finished, fleeing from the confessional, as if fleeing from hell itself, leaving Daniel alone with the devastating truth he had just discovered. He remained seated in the darkness for long minutes, listening to the echo of her sobs fading away, struggling to rebuild the walls that had been shaken. "She loves me," he murmured to the silence, testing the words as if they were poison. "But this changes nothing, it cannot change. Men like me don't deserve love, don't know what to do with it." She ran out of the confessional, but Daniel could still hear the echo of her sob. Sometime later, the Colombo mansion was immersed in wedding preparations. When Daniel came down for dinner, his face an impenetrable mask hiding the internal turmoil that had consumed him since Vittoria's confession. He had spent hours in his office trying to rationalize what he had heard, trying to categorize her feelings as something controllable, something that didn't threaten the rigid order of his existence. But her words echoed in his mind, each declaration of love like a crack in his carefully constructed armor. Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his black shirt with precise movements, mentally preparing himself to face Vittoria, as if he were preparing for a dangerous negotiation. "Keep your distance," he ordered himself as he descended the stairs. "Treat her as you always have, with cold courtesy. Nothing has changed. Nothing can change." Vittoria was already seated when he entered the dining room, and Daniel needed to use all his self-control not to show a reaction upon seeing her in the black dress he had chosen. The fabric embraced every curve of her body like a second skin, revealing the creamy skin of her shoulders and the tempting valley between her breasts, the length perfectly calculated to show her shapely legs without being vulgar. She had pinned her hair in an elaborate bun that exposed the graceful line of her neck, wearing the diamond earrings he had left in her room without any note or explanation. Daniel felt something primitive stir inside him at seeing her like this, but immediately suppressed the sensation, classifying it as mere physical desire. "She's a beautiful woman," he rationalized coldly as he took his place at the table. "It's natural to feel physical attraction. It doesn't mean anything beyond the obvious." Dinner began in the customary silence, but there was something different in the air, an electric tension that Daniel tried to ignore as he methodically cut his food. He kept his eyes on his plate, refusing to look at Vittoria, but he could feel her presence like a warmth from across the table. Each time she moved, the soft rustle of her dress reached him. Each time she breathed a little deeper, he noticed, and it irritated him profoundly. Men like Daniel Colombo weren't distracted by women, didn't lose focus because of pretty dresses or delicate perfumes. But then Vittoria reached for her wineglass, and their eyes met for a brief moment, and Daniel saw in her brown eyes the same torment that he refused to acknowledge in himself. She's suffering, he realized with an uncomfortable pang. Suffering because she thinks I see her only as property. The accident with the wine seemed to happen in slow motion, the glass tipping over, the scarlet liquid spreading across her dress. Vittoria stood up immediately, her face flushed with embarrassment as she pressed the napkin against the fabric, murmuring apologies that Daniel barely heard. He watched her hurry toward the bathroom, and then, before he could stop himself, he stood up and followed her, his steps silent on the thick carpet of the hallway. It was irrational. It was dangerous for his already shaken self-control, but something stronger than reason impelled him. Just checking if she's all right, he lied to himself as he positioned himself in the dark corridor. It's my responsibility as a host, nothing more. Daniel waited, leaning against the wall, the darkness of the corridor partially concealing his imposing figure, creating a play of shadows that made the moment even more intimate. When Vittoria came out of the bathroom, her dress showing only a damp stain where she had tried to clean the wine, she stopped abruptly upon seeing him, her eyes widening with surprise and something that Daniel refused to identify as hope. The narrow corridor forced them into a dangerous proximity, and Daniel could feel the heat emanating from her body, could see the quickened pulse at the base of her delicate neck. He should have kept silent, should have moved away, but the words escaped before he could contain them. "The dress looked perfect on you," he said, his voice coming out huskier than normal, betraying an intensity he hadn't intended to reveal. Vittoria lowered her eyes, her long eyelashes creating shadows on her cheeks, and when she responded there was bitterness in her voice that Daniel recognized as disguised pain. The word property left her lips like an accusation, and Daniel felt something dark and possessive stir in his chest. Before he could control himself, he moved, cornering her against the wall without touching her, creating a prison of heat and tension around her. It was a predatory, dominant movement, exactly the kind of display of power that would confirm her worst assumptions about him. But Daniel couldn't step away. "You always choose your properties well," she said, and the barely disguised pain in her voice hit him like acid. Her question came as a whispered challenge, and Daniel found himself leaning closer until he could feel her ragged breath against his face. The self-control he had maintained for 3 months was shattering, each second in that dangerous proximity, eroding years of emotional discipline. He placed his hand on the wall beside her face, his fingers accidentally brushing against a few strands of hair that had escaped from her bun, and the soft touch was like electricity on his nerve endings. Her question echoed between them, demanding an answer that Daniel wasn't prepared to give. "Isn't that what I am? Something you bought?" Daniel fought against words that wanted to escape, truths that men like him didn't admit, vulnerabilities they couldn't allow themselves. Instead, he answered with a half-truth, his voice coming out as a low growl that revealed more than he intended. When he said she had never been his property, he saw the surprise in her eyes, followed by a confusion that made him want to explain everything, confess that he watched her with the same intensity with which she watched him, that he too had dreams that shamed him. But that would be admitting weakness, would be admitting that Daniel Colombo, the most feared man in the city, was capable of feelings he had long sworn to have eradicated. "You were never my property, Vittoria," he said, the words scraping his throat like glass. The tremor that ran through Vittoria's body was visible even in the dimness, and when she nervously moistened her lips, Daniel had to clench his fists to not give in to the impulse to kiss her. Her next question floated between them like a prayer, and Daniel knew that his answer would seal something irreversible between them. She wanted to know what she was to him, if not property, and the truth was so terrifying that Daniel preferred to take refuge in metaphors. When he moved his thumb to brush her jawline, the gentlest touch his blood-stained hands had ever performed, he felt the last defenses crumble. "So what am I?" she asked, and there was so much longing in the question that even Daniel's stone heart recognized the echo of his own unacknowledged desire. The answer came before he could censor it, a single word carrying more truth than Daniel had admitted to himself in decades. It was a confession disguised as an accusation, an admission of vulnerability masked as a declaration of power. When he said she was his downfall, Daniel wasn't lying. Vittoria had systematically destroyed every certainty he had about himself, about his inability to feel, about his immunity to love. But men like him didn't admit such things, didn't allow themselves such weakness, so he wrapped the truth in ambiguous words that she could interpret as she wished. "My downfall," he whispered against her lips, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath, but still maintaining the crucial distance that protected him from crossing a line from which there would be no return. The sound of approaching voices broke the moment like shattering glass, and Daniel pulled away abruptly, leaving Vittoria breathless against the wall. He memorized the image of her there, vulnerable and wanting, lips parted in a silent invitation he had no right to accept. Without saying anything more, Daniel turned and walked back to the dining room, each step a battle against the impulse to return and take what they both clearly desired. But men like him didn't yield to impulses, didn't allow themselves weaknesses, didn't fall in love. "It's just desire," he repeated like a mantra as he sat at the empty table. Nothing more than perfectly controllable physical attraction. Vittoria remained in the hallway for long minutes after Daniel left, her body trembling not from cold, but from the intensity of what had almost happened. She pressed her fingers to the lips he had almost kissed, still feeling the ghost of his breath against her skin. His words echoed in her mind, creating more questions than answers, more confusion than clarity. When she finally managed to move and return to the dining room, she found Daniel already finishing his meal, his face once again an impenetrable mask, as if the moment in the hallway had never happened. "Perhaps I imagined it," she thought desperately. "Perhaps I'm seeing things that don't exist because I want so badly for them to exist." The rest of dinner passed in silence, even heavier than usual, both lost in their own torments. Daniel kept his eyes fixed anywhere except on her, his jaw tense with the effort of maintaining control. Vittoria barely touched her food, her stomach too churned by tension and confusion to eat. When the servants came to clear the plates, she took the opportunity to stand up, murmuring something about needing to rest for the big day. Daniel also rose, the automatic courtesy of a host, and for a moment they stood there, separated by the length of the table, but connected by something invisible and undeniable. "Sleep well, Vittoria," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Vittoria nodded, not trusting her voice to respond, and practically fled the room. She climbed the stairs almost running, the wine-stained dress being the least of her problems, as she tried to process everything that had happened. Once safe in her room, she threw herself on the bed fully dressed, hugging a pillow against her chest as if she could physically contain the emotions that threatened to overflow. Daniel's behavior tonight had been different. There was something in his eyes when he cornered her against the wall, something that looked dangerously like desire, perhaps even something deeper. "No," she chided herself. "Don't create hope where none exists. Tomorrow you marry a man who sees you as property, nothing more." Daniel remained in the empty dining room for a long time after Vittoria went upstairs, drinking whiskey and trying to drown the truth that refused to stay buried. Her words in the confessional kept echoing in his mind, the confession of love that should have been impossible, but that resonated with something deep and long denied within him. Men like Daniel Colombo didn't love, they conquered. They didn't protect out of affection, but out of pride. They didn't dream of women, they just possessed them. But Vittoria had penetrated every defense, had infiltrated every thought, had transformed his ordered existence into chaos. "Tomorrow she will be my wife," he murmured to the empty glass, "and I will continue to be the same cold man I've always been, because it's all I know how to be." He returned to the dinner, but Vittoria could still feel his warmth in the hallway. The wedding eve party was in full swing when Ugo Franco walked through the doors of the main hall of the Colombo mansion, his uninvited presence causing murmurs among the few selected guests. Vittoria was near the French windows, politely conversing with the wife of one of Daniel's associates, when she felt a familiar presence and turned to find Ugo walking toward her with a confident smile. Before she could react or move away, he took her hand and brought it to his lips, the kiss lasting much longer than appropriate, his blue eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her blush with discomfort. The room seemed to fall silent around them, or perhaps it was just her imagination, but Vittoria could feel the weight of curious glances upon them. "Vittoria more beautiful than I remembered," Ugo said, his voice laden with an intimacy he had no right to display. Daniel was at the top of the marble staircase when he saw Ugo Franco enter his house uninvited, the audacity of the gesture making his blood boil with cold, controlled anger. But it was when he saw the man approach Vittoria and take her hand, bringing it to his lips with a familiarity that shouldn't exist, that something primitive and possessive roared inside him. His fingers closed around the banister with enough force to make the wood creak. His jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached as he watched Ugo continue to hold Vittoria's hand even after the unnecessarily long kiss. Every second that passed, with another man touching what was his, increased the glacial fury that Daniel struggled to control, but he remained motionless, studying the situation like the calculating predator he was. Nobody touches what is mine, he thought, the raw possessiveness surprising even himself with its intensity. Ugo continued holding Vittoria's hand, his fingers gently caressing hers as he spoke, completely oblivious to the danger approaching. Vittoria tried to discreetly pull her hand away, her discomfort evident in the stiffness of her shoulders and the embarrassed flush of her cheeks, but Ugo seemed determined to maintain the physical contact. He leaned in closer, his voice low but still audible to the curious onlookers around them, his words laden with implications that made Vittoria's stomach twist with anxiety. "I heard you're getting married," he said, his eyes searching hers as if he could read secrets there. "I hope it's for love this time, not like that ridiculous proposal your father mentioned about debts." Vittoria tried again to pull her hand away, more firmly this time, but Ugo merely tightened his grip, his blue eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. She could feel the sweat forming on her palms, the dark blue dress she had chosen for the occasion suddenly feeling too suffocating as she struggled to maintain her composure in front of the guests who pretended not to be watching her every move. Ugo continued talking, his voice taking on a melancholic tone that made her want to flee, his words bringing back memories of a simpler time when they were just university students without the complications of the real world. "I always regretted not fighting for you in college," he confessed, completely oblivious to her growing discomfort. "I should have been braver, should have declared my feelings before it was too late." The sound of Daniel's footsteps descending the stairs echoed through the hall like distant thunder, each measured and deliberate step causing the conversations around them to gradually cease. Vittoria felt his presence before she even saw him, the atmosphere in the room changing, becoming charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She turned her head slightly and saw him approaching, his face a mask of lethal calm that she had learned to recognize as a sign of imminent danger, his black eyes fixed on Ugo with murderous intensity. Daniel stopped directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, his hand possessively resting on her waist with a pressure that was both a warning and a claim. "Franco," he said, his voice so cold it could freeze hell, each syllable pronounced with surgical precision. Ugo finally seemed to perceive the danger, but maintained his defiant posture, still holding Vittoria's hand as if he had some right to her. The tension between the two men was palpable, causing the closest guests to discreetly move away, recognizing the signs of an imminent confrontation between two alpha predators. Daniel pulled Vittoria against his chest with a fluid movement, his arm circling possessively around her waist, marking his territory unequivocally for everyone in the room. Vittoria's body automatically molded to his, an unconscious gesture that didn't go unnoticed by either of the two men, making Daniel's eyes shine with dark satisfaction while Ugo's face contorted in frustration. "Colombo," Ugo responded, finally releasing Vittoria's hand but not backing away. "I was just greeting your fiancé." The pause before the word fiancé was deliberate, loaded with implications that made Daniel's arm tighten even more around Vittoria. She could feel the tension in every muscle of his body, the contained violence vibrating beneath the surface of his apparent control, and instinctively placed a hand on his chest in a gesture that could be interpreted as calming or possessive. Daniel tilted his head slightly, his lips brushing her hair as he spoke, his voice low but perfectly audible to Ugo and anyone close enough to hear. "My future wife," he corrected with absolute authority, each word a declaration of possession, "and you're holding her hand for too long for a simple greeting." Ugo finally took a step back, but his eyes remained fixed on Vittoria, completely ignoring the implicit threat in Daniel's posture. There was something desperate in his gaze, an urgency that made Vittoria press even more against Daniel, unconsciously seeking his protection, even knowing he was as dangerous as the man in front of her. Ugo opened his mouth to speak again, his words clearly directed only to her, as if Daniel wasn't there holding her possessively. "Vittoria, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me," he said, the meaning behind the words crystal clear to everyone present. Daniel interrupted before Vittoria could even process Ugo's veiled offer, his voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. His hand moved from Vittoria's back to her nape, his fingers intertwining in her hair in a gesture that was both possessive and curiously tender, making her shiver involuntarily against him. Every word that left his mouth was pronounced with the finality of a death sentence, his eyes never leaving Ugo's face as he unequivocally established to whom Vittoria belonged. "She has everything she needs," Daniel said, his voice loaded with mortal warning. "With me." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife, the three standing in a tableau of unresolved tension, while the guests around pretended to be absorbed in their own conversations. Daniel leaned in to whisper in Vittoria's ear, but his voice was deliberately loud enough for Ugo to hear every word, every syllable a calculated provocation that made the other man clench his fists. His hot breath against her ear made Vittoria shiver, her body responding involuntarily to his proximity in a way that embarrassed and excited her in equal measure. "Let's go, love," Daniel said, the term of endearment sounding strange and wonderful at the same time. "We have private matters to resolve." Daniel guided Vittoria out of the room with a firm hand on her back, his steps determined as he led her through the corridors of the mansion toward the private library. Vittoria could feel the guests' gazes burning into her back, could hear the whispers beginning even before they were out of sight. But all of this seemed distant compared to the storm she could feel forming in the man beside her. When they reached the library, Daniel opened the door and practically pushed her inside, closing and locking it behind them with a definitive click that made Vittoria's heart race. The room was lit only by the fire in the fireplace and a few reading lamps, creating dancing shadows that made the moment even more intimate and dangerous. "Daniel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from anticipation. Before Vittoria could say anything else, Daniel pressed her against the door, his large body creating a cage of heat and muscle around her. His hands splayed against the wood on either side of her head, his black eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath, while his chest rose and fell with controlling breaths. Vittoria could see the battle happening inside him, the iron control he always maintained fighting against something more primitive and powerful, and she found herself rooting for control to lose. "He touched you," Daniel said, his voice hoarse and dangerous, not a question but a statement loaded with raw possessiveness that made something inside her liquefy. Vittoria tried to respond, tried to explain that Ugo's touch meant nothing, that she had tried to move away, but the words died in her throat when she saw the expression on Daniel's face. It was pure masculine possessiveness, raw jealousy mixed with something deeper and more dangerous, something she dared hope was love. His next words hit her like lightning, making her entire body shudder with the force of the statement, with the promise and threat implicit in them. "Nobody touches you," Daniel growled, leaning in until his lips were just a breath away. "Nobody but me." Then, before Vittoria could process what was happening, Daniel kissed her with an intensity that stole any coherent thought from her mind. It wasn't a gentle or hesitant kiss. It was possessive, hungry, desperate, as if he was trying to mark her as his with his lips, trying to erase any memory of another man's touch. His hands left the door to bury themselves in her hair, destroying the elaborate hairstyle that had taken hours to create. But Vittoria didn't care, because her own hands were clutching the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer. She moaned against his mouth when he deepened the kiss, his tongue invading, conquering, and Vittoria surrendered completely, melting against him like wax under a flame. "My God," she managed to think amid the whirlwind of sensations, "he's kissing me as if his life depended on it." Daniel's hands were everywhere, sliding from her hair to her waist to her back, mapping every curve of her body through the fabric of her dress, as if he were memorizing her by touch. Vittoria had never been kissed like this. had never felt this kind of consuming desire that made every nerve ending in her body come alive, that made her legs tremble and her heart beat so hard she was sure he could hear it. When Daniel finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless, their breaths mingling in the minimal space between them, and Vittoria had to lean against the door to keep from falling. Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes still closed as if he were fighting to regain control, his chest rising and falling rapidly against hers. "You are mine, Vittoria," he said, his voice hoarse and broken. "Not because I bought you, but because—" He paused, took a deep breath, and when he opened his eyes, Vittoria saw in them a vulnerability she never imagined Daniel Colombo could possess. "Because I love you, hopelessly, madly, since the first day you walked into my house and looked at me as if I were a man, not a monster." He kissed her as if the world were about to end, but it was the next day that the danger really began. Chapter 4. The Kidnapping on the Wedding Day. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and sunny, with golden rays entering through the windows of Vittoria's room as she prepared for the most important day of her life. She was radiant in her white dress, the bodice embroidered with small pearls hugging her curves perfectly, the skirt flowing like water around her legs, transforming her into an ethereal vision. Her mind was still spinning with the memory of Daniel's kiss the night before, with his words of love that had destroyed all her doubts and fears, replacing them with a happiness so intense that she could barely contain it. Vittoria lightly touched her lips, still able to feel the ghost of his kiss, still able to hear the echo of his desperate confession, and a soft smile curved her lips as she looked at herself in the mirror. "Today I marry the man I love," she whispered to her reflection, "and he loves me too, against all odds." Vittoria's maid of honor, a distant cousin who was the only family that had attended, had left minutes before to fetch the bouquet that had been left downstairs. Vittoria took advantage of the moment of solitude to touch up her lipstick, her hands trembling slightly, not from nervousness, but from anticipation, imagining the moment she would walk down the aisle toward Daniel. She was so lost in her happy thoughts that she responded distractedly when she heard a knock on the door, assuming it was her cousin returning with the flowers. The sound of the door opening and closing did not initially alarm her, but when she turned from the mirror and saw Ugo Franco standing there, her heart froze with shock and a terrible premonition settled in her stomach. "Ugo," she gasped, rising abruptly, the dress rustling around her. "You shouldn't be here." Ugo closed the door behind him with a soft but definitive click, his blue eyes scanning Vittoria's figure with a mixture of desire and desperation that made her instinctively step back. He was impeccably dressed in a grey suit, but there was something wild in his eyes, something that set off all of Vittoria's internal alarms as she calculated the distance to the door and her chances of getting past him. Ugo took a step toward her, his hands extended in a gesture that was probably meant to be reassuring, but only made her back away further. "You look beautiful, Vittoria," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Too beautiful to waste your life with a criminal like Colombo." Vittoria straightened her shoulders, finding courage in the memory of Daniel's love, in the certainty that he would come for her if she needed him. She kept her voice steady despite the growing fear, her eyes never leaving Ugo's face as she tried to reason with him, tried to make him understand that he was making a terrible mistake. The wedding dress suddenly seemed like too fragile an armor, and she desperately wished that Daniel would appear, that somehow he would sense that she needed him. "Ugo, you need to leave now," she said with all the authority she could muster. "I cannot let you do this, marry out of obligation." Ugo's words hit her like cold water, making her stop mid-movement as she processed what he was saying. Vittoria shook her head vehemently, her carefully arranged curls bouncing with the movement, her voice gaining strength with the conviction of her feelings. She thought of Daniel, of his desperate kiss the night before, of his confession of love that had healed all the wounds she thought would never heal, and knew with absolute certainty that was where she belonged. "Vince, not out of obligation," she declared firmly, her eyes shining with determination. "I love him, Ugo. I love Daniel with all my heart and soul." Ugo shook his head as if she had said something incomprehensible, his eyes filling with a pity that made Vittoria's anger boil. He continued approaching, ignoring her protests, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made her want to scream in frustration. How dare he presume to know what she felt? How dare he reduce her love for Daniel to some kind of psychological illness? It's Stockholm Syndrome, Ugo insisted, gesturing dramatically. He bought you, he kept you in that mansion like a bird in a golden cage. Vittoria tried to get around him to reach the door, but Ugo was faster, blocking her path with his body. Panic began to rise in her throat when she realized he wasn't just making an inappropriate visit, that there was something more sinister in his intentions. She tried to stay calm, tried to continue reasoning with him even as her heart beat frantically against her ribs. "You don't understand," she said desperately, trying to make him see the truth. "Daniel freed me, he didn't imprison me, he showed me what true love is." Ugo's next words shocked her even more, making her stop breathing for a moment as she processed the magnitude of what he was saying. He smiled as if he had done something noble, as if he expected her to be grateful, completely oblivious to the growing horror on her face. The revelation that he had paid her father's debt should have relieved her, but instead it only filled her with anger and despair because she didn't want to be free of Daniel, had never wanted to be. "I paid your debt, Vittoria," Ugo announced proudly. "The money is in your father's account. You're free to leave with me." Vittoria gasped, her hands flying to cover her mouth as the full impact of Ugo's actions hit her. She shook her head frantically, backing away until her back touched the dressing table, knocking over bottles of perfume that fell to the floor with a clatter. Tears of frustration and fear began to form in her eyes, smudging her carefully applied makeup. But she didn't care because all that mattered was making Ugo understand that she didn't want his help. "No," she practically shouted, her voice breaking with emotion. "I don't want to be free of him, don't you understand?" Ugo quickly approached, grabbing Vittoria's arm. She tried to break free, but Ugo held her there, starting to lead her toward the door, completely ignoring her increasingly desperate protests. "Come with me," he insisted, his voice losing any pretense of gentleness. "My car is waiting outside." Vittoria tried to get out and free herself, but the wedding dress hindered her movements, the voluminous skirt tangling around her legs as she tried to find a way out. When she managed to fill her lungs with enough air, she screamed with all the strength of her lungs, a sound that echoed through the corridors of the mansion. "No!" she screamed, tears flowing freely now. "Daniel, help!" Ugo quickly covered Vittoria's mouth with his free hand, while continuing to try to take her toward the door. She desperately prayed that Daniel would find her in time. "Please, Vittoria," Ugo said, his voice trying to sound reassuring but coming out only disturbing. "It's for your own good." The sound of the door exploding against the wall was like thunder in the silent room, and Vittoria never felt as much relief as when she saw Daniel standing there, his expression a mask of murderous fury. He was dressed in his wedding suit, impeccable except for the slightly crooked tie as if he had run all the way there, and behind him she could see several of his men, all with equally deadly expressions. Daniel's gaze quickly passed over the scene, absorbing Vittoria's torn dress, her tears, Ugo's hand still covering her mouth, and something dangerous and lethal flashed in his black eyes. "Take," he said, each word pronounced with deadly precision, "your hands off her." Ugo instinctively pulled Vittoria in front of him, using her as a human shield between himself and Daniel, a cowardly move that made Vittoria's contempt for him crystallize into pure hatred. She could feel Ugo's body trembling behind her, could feel his fear emanating from him in waves, but he still maintained his grip on her, still trying to maintain his facade of savior. Daniel didn't look away from Vittoria's face, his eyes softening slightly when they met hers, a silent promise passing between them that everything would be all right. "She's coming with me, Colombo," Ugo said, trying to sound confident but failing miserably. "She's free from the debt now." Daniel took a calculated step forward, his movement fluid and predatory, never taking his eyes off Vittoria while speaking directly to her, completely ignoring Ugo. There was something comforting in his lethal calm, in his absolute confidence that he would resolve this, that he would protect her as he had always promised to do. Vittoria found strength in his gaze, stopping her struggle and waiting for the right moment, completely trusting the man she loved. "Love," Daniel said, his voice soft but loaded with intensity, "look at me. Do you want to go with him?" Vittoria shook her head vehemently, fresh tears streaming down her face, and saw Daniel's jaw clench with contained fury as he took another calculated step forward, his men strategically spreading throughout the room, cutting off any escape route Ugo might try, and when Daniel spoke again, his voice was pure death personified. "Release my bride, Franco, or I swear by all that is holy that you won't leave this room in one piece," he said when Daniel's security guards appeared. Before Vittoria could blink, Ugo was taken away by Daniel's security guards, dragged out of the room while screaming empty promises of coming back for her. Daniel crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, wrapping Vittoria in his arms, with a tenderness that completely contrasted with the contained violence of moments before. She collapsed against his chest, sobbing with relief as he murmured comforting words in her ear, his large hands caressing her back in smooth, calming movements. The wedding dress was slightly torn at the sleeve where Ugo had held her tightly, but Daniel kissed her temple and whispered that everything would be perfect, that nothing would prevent this wedding from happening. "You're safe now, my love," he murmured against her hair. "No one will ever try to take you away from me again." An hour later, Vittoria entered the church to the majestic sound of the organ, her dress repaired by the skillful hands of her maid of honor, and her makeup retouched to hide any trace of earlier tears. The nave was decorated with white lilies that perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance, and rows of guests turned to admire her as she slowly walked down the aisle. But Vittoria only had eyes for Daniel, standing at the altar in his impeccable black suit, his dark eyes shining with barely contained emotion that made her heart race. Each step she took toward him seemed to last an eternity and pass in the blink of an eye at the same time, and when she finally reached the altar, Daniel extended his hand to her with a gesture that was both possessive and reverent. "Beautiful," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "absolutely stunning." The priest began the ceremony with the traditional words, but Vittoria could barely concentrate on anything beyond Daniel's overwhelming presence beside her. Their hands were intertwined, and she could feel his warmth through the lace gloves she wore, could see the way his jaw clenched as if he were fighting to contain too many emotions to express. When it came time for the vows, Daniel released the paper the priest offered him, letting it float to the floor as he took both of Vittoria's hands in his. His eyes never left hers as he spoke, each word coming directly from his soul without filters or barriers. "Vittoria," he began, his strong voice echoing through the silent church, "you entered my life unexpectedly. I, a cold man who never imagined falling in love, found myself completely and irreducibly in love," Daniel continued, his words flowing with a raw honesty that brought tears to Vittoria's eyes. He confessed how he had tried to keep his distance, how he had built walls around his heart, that she had destroyed without even trying, just by being herself. The revelation about the confessional made some guests gasp in surprise, but Daniel didn't care about the scandal, focused only on the woman before him. His hands tightened around hers when he spoke about discovering he was loved, when he had always believed he was only feared, about how she had taught him that true power wasn't to possess, but to protect. "So you taught me that strength is not dominating," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "It's loving with every fiber of my being, even when it terrifies me." Daniel's promises came next, each one more intense than the last, making Vittoria's heart expand until she thought it might burst with happiness. He promised to be the man she deserved, even while remaining in the shadowy world he commanded, because he knew she accepted him completely, light and darkness intertwined. He promised that every danger he would face would be to keep her safe, that every difficult decision would be made thinking of protecting her. When he finished with a final declaration of love that transcended reason and control, Vittoria was openly crying, not caring that her makeup was probably ruined again. "I love you beyond reason," Daniel concluded, bringing her hands to his lips. "Beyond control, beyond everything I thought I knew about myself." Vittoria took several deep breaths before beginning her own vows, her voice trembling with emotion, but gaining strength with each word. She looked deeply into Daniel's eyes, seeing in them the reflection of her own love, and began her confession with the naked truth of how it all began. She spoke about how he had bought her with money, but how she had sold herself for love from the moment she saw him, from the instant their gazes met, and something fundamental changed in her world. The words flowed like water, each confession deeper than the last, revealing how he had freed her from a life without passion, without purpose, without true love. "I thought I would be your prisoner," she said, smiling through tears. "But you freed me from fear, from loneliness, from an empty existence." The revelation about the confessional came next, and Vittoria saw surprise and then understanding cross Daniel's face. She confessed that she had poured out her heart thinking it was a sacred secret, but that he had heard every word. Every declaration of love she thought was hidden. And even knowing everything, he had still chosen her, still decided to love her, still wanted to marry her. Her next words were a declaration of total acceptance, choosing every facet of him, every contradiction that made him who he was. "I choose you too," she declared firmly, "the man who protects me with tenderness, the feared boss who loves me with devotion, the mafioso who kneels only before me." Even before the priest could pronounce the traditional words authorizing the kiss, Daniel pulled Vittoria to him, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both a claim and a surrender. The church erupted in applause as they lost themselves in each other, the world around them disappearing until there were only the two of them and the love that consumed them. When they finally separated, both were breathless, and Vittoria could see tears in Daniel's eyes, something she doubted any other guest would ever witness. The priest, recovering from the non-traditional moment, hurried to declare them husband and wife, although it seemed redundant after the demonstration of love everyone had just witnessed. "Finally," Daniel whispered against her lips, "finally you are completely mine." The reception was held in the Colombo Mansion's ballroom, transformed into a paradise of white flowers and golden lights that created a magical atmosphere. Vittoria had changed from her ceremony dress into a simpler one for the party, but Daniel couldn't take his eyes off her, as if he still couldn't believe she was real, that she was his. During dinner, he kept her hand intertwined with his, bringing it to his lips periodically as if he needed the constant contact to assure himself it wasn't a dream. The guests made elaborate toasts, but Vittoria barely heard them, lost in the private world she and Daniel had created, where only the two of them existed. "I can't believe you're my wife," Daniel murmured in her ear during one of the speeches. "Tell me I'm not dreaming." When the time came for the first dance, Daniel led Vittoria to the center of the ballroom with the grace of a man who was completely comfortable commanding any space. The music began, a classic waltz that filled the air with its romantic melody, and he pulled her into his arms with a gentle possessiveness that made her melt. They moved together as if they had danced 1,000 times before, each step perfectly synchronized, each movement flowing naturally into the next. It was during this dance, with all eyes on them, that Vittoria decided to make her final confession, leaning in to whisper in Daniel's ear. "I knew it was you in the confessional," she admitted, feeling him momentarily freeze in her arms. Daniel stopped dancing completely, pulling back slightly to look at Vittoria's face with absolute shock. His eyes searched hers, seeking confirmation that he had heard correctly, and Vittoria smiled with a mischievousness he had never seen before. The music continued playing around them. Other couples had joined the dance floor, but Daniel and Vittoria stood still in the center, lost in their own bubble of revelation. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again, clearly struggling to process this information that changed everything he thought he knew about that crucial moment. "What?" he finally managed to say, his voice a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "You knew all along?" Vittoria nodded, her smile widening as she explained, her hands rising to frame his face with infinite tenderness. She spoke about his unique cologne, that blend of sandalwood and something purely Daniel, that she would recognize anywhere, even through the heavy incense of the church. But more than that, it was the way he said she was forgiven, with so much desire and pain in his voice that no real priest would ever express. She had seen through his disguise but chose to continue, chose to confess everything, even knowing it was him listening. "Your cologne gave you away," she said softly, "and no priest would say you are forgiven, with as much desire in his voice as you did." Daniel laughed, the rich and genuine sound echoing through the ballroom, and he spun her in the air, making her dress float around them like clouds. When he set her back on the ground, his eyes were shining with amusement and something deeper, more intense as he processed the implications of her revelation. She had known it was him and yet had confessed her love, had still poured out her heart, had still chosen him. He pulled her back into his arms, resuming the dance with renewed vigor, spinning her around the ballroom as if they were alone in the world. "My clever, mischievous wife," he murmured against her ear. "You let me think I had a secret when you knew all along." Vittoria explained as they danced, her words flowing between the movements of the waltz, why she needed him to know, to hear from her even if indirectly. She needed to free those words, needed to confess her love even if he never reciprocated, needed him to understand that she loved him not out of obligation or Stockholm Syndrome, but by choice. Each word was a revelation, showing Daniel that she was much stronger and shrewder than he had ever imagined, that she had chosen him with full knowledge of who he was. "But I needed you to know," she whispered, "to hear from me, even if indirectly, that I loved you completely." Their final words as they danced sealed their joined fate, each declaration a promise of an intertwined future. Daniel confessed that that moment in the confessional had changed his life, destroyed his certainties about his inability to love, showed that he was worthy of being loved despite everything. His hands held Vittoria as if she were made of the most delicate porcelain, but his eyes burned with an intensity that promised much less gentle passions for when they would be alone. He spun her once more, bringing her back against his chest, and whispered against her temple, as if confessing the deepest secrets of the universe. "For years I believed that men like me were incapable of love," he admitted, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "That power and my dark world had corroded any ability to feel something pure. But then you entered my life and proved that I was wrong about everything." The guests around them had begun to disperse, some going to their tables, others looking for drinks, but Daniel and Vittoria continued dancing, lost in their own world. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, and smiled as she felt his lips press against the top of her head. There was something deeply intimate about this moment, even more than the passionate kiss at the altar, because here, in front of everyone, but at the same time completely alone, they were choosing each other again, confirming the promises made before God and men. "You know what impresses me the most," Vittoria murmured against his chest. "It's that you, the most powerful and feared man in this city, disguised yourself as a priest just to know what I felt, as if my opinion was the only one that mattered in the world." Daniel laughed softly, the sound reverberating through his chest and making Vittoria smile even more. He spun her one last time as the music came to an end, dramatically dipping her backward, in a move that drew applause from the guests who were still watching. But before lifting her up, he leaned over her, their faces inches apart, and asked the question that would definitively seal their future. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises. "Are you ready for life as Mrs. Colombo?" he asked, and there were so many layers to that question, so many implications about the dark world she was fully entering. Vittoria entwined her arms around his neck, pulling herself up until her lips were a breath away from his. She could feel his breath mingling with hers, could see every nuance of emotion passing through his dark eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be. When she answered, her voice was full of conviction, each word a promise, a vow, a declaration of war against anything that tried to separate them. "Ready for everything," she promised against his lips, sealing the words with a soft kiss that soon deepened. "Forever, my love, forever. Whatever that means in your world, I choose you. I choose us. I choose our love above all else." Daniel lifted her up, spinning her in the air as he laughed, a sound of pure happiness that made everyone in the hall stop to watch. When he set her back on the ground, he took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that was both possessive and tender. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her wedding ring, and then pulled her against his side, keeping her close as they walked together off the dance floor. But even as they mingled with the guests, greeting and thanking them, his hand never let go of hers, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he let her go. He held her hand, like someone who will never let go. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll wait for you there.